that person was carrying a child.
And you say a person, male or female?
Not a male.
So I went into our bedroom and she wasn't there. And that was the first time really that the panic hit. And I just ran back into her bedroom, and literally at that point, the curtains, which were closed, just kind of flew open.
A quiet holiday evening in the Algarve, Portugal, turned into a nightmare that would haunt the world for years to come. On May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort. In the confusion and panic that followed, one woman's words would rise above all others, Jane Tanner. She claimed that at precisely 9:15 p.m., she saw something chilling. A man dressed in dark clothing hurrying across the narrow street, cradling a small child in pale pajamas. The child's bare feet dangled limply, her body appearing lifeless in his arms. That fleeting glimpse became the cornerstone of the abduction theory, painted vividly by the press, seized upon by investigators, and burned into public memory. Yet the disturbing truth is this: no one else saw it. Not Jerry McCann, Madeleine's father, who stood only meters away. Not Jez Wilkins, a fellow holidaymaker speaking with him on that same street. Only Jane Tanner. And so, the haunting question remains: did she truly witness the moment Madeleine was taken into the night, or did her testimony unknowingly create a narrative that would shape and perhaps distort the world's understanding of one of the greatest mysteries of the 21st century? To understand why Jane Tanner's testimony became so central, we first need to step into the world of that holiday in Praia da Luz. Kate and Jerry McCann, both doctors from the United Kingdom, had traveled to Portugal with their 3 children. Madeleine, just 3 years old, and her younger twin siblings, Sean and Amélie. They weren't alone. Surrounding them was a close-knit group of friends who had also brought their families. This circle would later become known as the Tapas 7, named after the resort's tapas bar, where they dined together each evening. The arrangement was meant to be simple, even convenient. Each night, the adults would gather for dinner, while their children slept in nearby apartments scattered around the Ocean Club complex. To ease their worries, they set up a rotation system. Every 20 to 30 minutes, one parent from the group would quietly excuse themselves, walk back to their apartment, and check that the children were still safe in bed. The McCann's apartment, number 5A, was on the ground floor, close to the pool but tucked slightly out of sight. From the tapas bar, it was only about 55 meters away, but the view was blocked by trees, walls, and winding garden paths. Parents could not simply glance up to reassure themselves. They had to physically walk the route. Among this group was Jane Tanner, attending with her partner, Dr. Russell O'Brien, and their 2 young daughters. Like the others, they believed the arrangement struck a balance between safety and relaxation, a way to enjoy dinner without neglecting parental duty. But this system, casual and uncoordinated, would later come under intense scrutiny. On the night of May 3, 2007, the Tapas 7 gathered as usual. Drinks were poured, food was ordered, conversation flowed easily. In the background, the quiet understanding remained. Checks would be made, one by one, as the evening unfolded. To the group, it was a routine that had worked before and would surely work again. But hindsight would reveal how fragile this arrangement truly was. For it was during one of these checks, in the narrow window of time between laughter at the dinner table and footsteps along a dimly lit street, that Jane Tanner would step into a role she never expected, becoming the only person to claim she saw Madeleine being carried away. At approximately 9:15 p.m. on May 3, 2007, Jane Tanner rose from the tapas bar table to carry out her turn in the group's checking routine. Her 2 daughters were asleep in their nearby ground floor apartment, and like the others in the group, she intended only a quick walk up the street and back. But what she claimed to witness on that short journey would soon become one of the most scrutinized moments in modern true crime history. As Jane walked up the narrow street that cut through the resort, she later told police she saw something unusual. A man was crossing the road, moving quickly, carrying a small child in his arms. The child, she recalled, was wearing light-colored pajamas and was barefoot. The way the child's body hung limply gave the impression that she was either asleep or unconscious. To Jane, in that fleeting moment, it looked like Madeleine. The sight lasted only seconds before she continued on her way, not confronting the man, not calling out, not stopping to look longer. The significance of her statement lay not only in what she described, but in when it happened. Jane placed her sighting at 9:15 p.m., just after Jerry McCann had returned from his own check at 9:05. Jerry reported that all 3 children were asleep when he left. On his way back to the restaurant, Jerry stopped outside the apartment block to chat with another guest, Jeremy Jez Wilkins, who was out walking with his own child. The 2 men stood on the very same street where Jane claimed to have seen the stranger carrying a child. Yet, neither Jerry nor Wilkins reported seeing anything unusual. This contradiction became one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. If Jane's account was accurate, it meant that within a 2 or 3 minute window, an abductor had carried Madeleine past 2 adults standing just meters away without them noticing. If her account was inaccurate, then a major cornerstone of the abduction theory rested on shaky ground. When investigators later reconstructed the evening, Jane's statement stood out starkly against the otherwise ordinary recollections of the Tapas 7. Matthew Oldfield, who performed a check at 9:30, admitted he didn't even look closely enough to confirm Madeleine's presence in her bed. Russell O'Brien, Jane's partner, was occupied with one of their daughters who had fallen ill. Other members of the group described dinner, drinks, and conversation. But Jane alone described a shadowy figure carrying a child into the night. Her testimony injected the word abduction into the narrative, giving Kate McCann's anguished cry of, "They've taken her," a visual companion. The story of a man with a child in pajamas transformed an otherwise ambiguous disappearance into a compelling narrative of kidnapping. The weight of her words was immense because they filled a gap that no physical evidence could bridge. There were no broken locks, no forced shutters, no ransom note. What remained was her memory, fragile, disputed, and yet powerful enough to shape the course of the entire investigation. For supporters of the abduction theory, Jane Tanner was the key witness, the one person who had seen the crime in progress. For skeptics, she was the weakest link, a lone voice describing something no one else noticed. Either way, her testimony was impossible to ignore. The reason Jane Tanner's words became so powerful lies in the emptiness of everything else. The McCann's apartment showed no sign of forced entry. The shutters were intact, the locks unbroken, the windows undisturbed except for Kate McCann's own fingerprints. There was no ransom note, no footprints in the garden, no clear trace of an intruder. Faced with this vacuum of physical evidence, investigators and the public clung to what they did have, the words of a witness. Jane Tanner's description offered not just details, but a story. It was a picture people could imagine, a dark figure striding across the street, a barefoot child in pale pajamas hanging limp in his arms. In the absence of proof, this single image carried extraordinary weight. Her testimony gave the disappearance a sequence, a timeline, and most importantly, a villain. Without her, Kate McCann's frantic cry of, "They've taken her," might have sounded like panic or assumption. With Jane's words, the cry gained a shadowy figure to match it. For the media, this was irresistible. British tabloids splashed headlines about the abductor, sketching efits and illustrations based on Jane's vague description. News reports repeated her account so often that it became etched into public memory, as though it were fact. Within days, the world believed Madeleine had been carried into the night by a stranger because Jane Tanner said she saw it. The police, too, were influenced. With no physical trail to follow, they leaned heavily on the timeline created by the Tapas 7 and Tanner's sighting. Jerry checked at 9:05. Jane saw the man at 9:15. Kate raised the alarm at typical. These 3 anchors framed the investigation and dictated its direction. Resources were mobilized in search of an intruder who may never have existed. But the impact went deeper. Tanner's account not only supported the theory of abduction, but also reinforced the credibility of the McCanns themselves. By placing Madeleine alive at 9:15 in the arms of a supposed stranger, her testimony indirectly shielded Jerry, who had been the last parent to see her in bed at 9:05. If Jane was correct, then Madeleine was alive after Jerry's check, making it less likely that something had happened inside the apartment before that moment. In effect, Tanner's words provided a bridge that seemed to absolve the parents from suspicion. This strategic value made her testimony all the more significant. It stabilized the narrative at a time when chaos and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm it. For investigators under pressure, and for a media hungry for clarity, Jane Tanner's image of the abductor filled the silence left by the absence of evidence. Whether right or wrong, her words created a lens through which the world understood the case, and that lens would prove almost impossible to remove. As quickly as Jane Tanner's testimony was elevated, doubts began to creep in. The contradictions were glaring, and the timing of her revelation raised troubling questions. Why had she not reacted immediately? Why did she not interrupt Jerry McCann's conversation with Jez Wilkins, two men standing only meters away from where she claimed to see the figure? Why did she remain silent when she returned to the tapas bar, mentioning nothing about the sighting until after Kate McCann discovered Madeleine missing at 10 p.m.? That delay would become one of the most troubling aspects of her account. If she had spoken up at 9:15, perhaps the alarm would have been raised earlier. Perhaps resort staff, police, or even members of the group might have intercepted the man she described. Instead, her words surfaced only after the crisis was already underway, which made them appear retrofitted, layered onto events that had already taken place. Her description also lacked precision. In her initial statement, she offered only the barest details. A man of medium build, dark clothes, carrying a child in pale pajamas. She did not describe the child's face. She could not say definitively whether the figure was male or female. The pajamas, she later said, resembled those Madeleine was wearing, but this detail was vague and emerged only after she was prompted. Over time, her description evolved, gaining new details that seemed to align too neatly with information that had already entered the public domain. To some investigators, this looked less like a memory becoming clearer and more like a memory being shaped by context. Portuguese police, led by Chief Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, were deeply skeptical. They noted that Tanner's sighting directly contradicted the presence of Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins on the very same street at the same time. Both men later confirmed their conversation, and both insisted they saw nothing unusual. For Amaral, this was not a minor oversight. If an abductor had passed directly by them, it should have been impossible for both to miss such a sight. The absence of physical evidence only compounded the problem. Forensic teams found no fingerprints, no fibers, no footprints that would support the theory of a man carrying a child out of the apartment. The shutters had not been forced, and the only fingerprints on the window belonged to Kate McCann herself. If an abduction had occurred in the manner Jane described, investigators expected to find at least some trace. Instead, there was nothing. Critics argued that Tanner's delay and the vagueness of her testimony opened the door to suggestion and hindsight. By the time she gave her full statement, the group had already been exposed to Kate's exclamation, "They've taken her," and the panic of a missing child had spread. In such an atmosphere, memory can unconsciously adjust to fit the emerging narrative. This made Tanner's account vulnerable to accusations that it was less an independent observation and more a contribution shaped by group dynamics and fear. For skeptics, Jane Tanner was not the reliable eyewitness the media portrayed, but the weakest link, a single uncorroborated voice propping up a fragile theory. And yet, despite the inconsistencies, her words remained central to the case. Whether mistaken, misinterpreted, or manipulated, her testimony carried a weight that hard evidence never did. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to consider whether Jane Tanner's sighting had nothing to do with Madeleine at all. Months later, a breakthrough came when a British holidaymaker admitted that on the very same night, around the same time, he had carried his young daughter back to his apartment after she had fallen asleep at a nearby crèche. His description of his clothing and the way he carried his child matched Tanner's account almost perfectly. For Portuguese police, this revelation was crucial. It suggested that what Jane had seen was not an abductor spiriting Madeleine into the night, but a tired father taking his own child home. If this was true, then Tanner's testimony had acted as a red herring, a detail so powerful that it shaped the course of the entire case, while ultimately pointing investigators in the wrong direction. For critics of the abduction theory, this discovery was damning. It confirmed what many had suspected from the beginning, that the cornerstone of the official narrative rested on a mistaken identification. Yet, while Tanner's sighting dominated headlines, another account slipped quietly into the shadows: the Smith sighting. Around 10 p.m., Martin Smith and several members of his family encountered a man carrying a small girl in his arms near the church in Praia da Luz. Like Tanner, they described the child as about 4 years old, wearing light-colored pajamas and barefoot. But unlike Tanner, the Smith's testimony was corroborated by multiple witnesses, several adults, and even children in their group. What made the Smith sighting particularly troubling was what Martin Smith would later say. Months after the disappearance, he reported that the man he saw that night bore a striking resemblance to Jerry McCann himself. He stressed that he could not be absolutely certain, but the possibility cast a long, uncomfortable shadow over the case. So, why did Tanner's sighting become the centerpiece of the investigation, while the Smith family's account was largely sidelined? The answer lies in convenience. Tanner's testimony supported the idea of an external abductor, a faceless stranger who could be hunted. Smith's testimony, by contrast, risked implicating Madeleine's own father, raising questions that the British media and the McCann supporters were unwilling to confront. Together, the two sightings reveal the fragile foundation of the case. One, possibly an innocent tourist; the other, a potential glimpse of someone far closer to home. In the years that followed, Jane Tanner's name remained inseparable from the Madeleine McCann case. To many, she was the fragile thread that kept the abduction theory alive. Her words gave the world an image, a shadowy figure and a child in pajamas, that resonated far more deeply than any forensic report ever could. But that same image also divided opinion. Supporters saw her as a brave witness who offered a critical piece of the puzzle. Skeptics, however, regarded her as the weakest link, someone whose uncertain memory misdirected investigators and allowed other possibilities to be ignored. Online forums, books, documentaries, and social media turned her sighting into a lightning rod for debate. Why did only she see the man? Why did her details change over time? Why did her account fit so conveniently into the McCann's timeline? These questions hardened public skepticism and fueled conspiracy theories that still circulate today. In a broader sense, Tanner's testimony revealed the fragility of eyewitness evidence. A single statement, repeated and amplified, shaped how millions understood the case. It showed how narrative can eclipse fact, and how quickly a story can become more powerful than truth. For better or worse, her words defined the mystery. The story of Jane Tanner is ultimately a reminder of how fragile truth can be when it rests on a single voice. Her testimony transformed an ordinary holiday tragedy into one of the most famous mysteries of our time. Without her, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann might have been viewed as a tragic accident, an unexplained absence, or even a domestic event cloaked in silence. With her, it became the story of an abduction, a stranger in the night, a child carried away, a family forever broken. And yet, the contradictions remain. Did Jane Tanner truly see what she believed, or did her mind, caught in the blur of fear and confusion, create an image that seemed real only in hindsight? For investigators, journalists, and the public, that question has never been resolved. What is clear is the impact. Her account did not simply describe events, it shaped them. It guided police inquiries, influenced media coverage, and divided public opinion for more than a decade. The lesson is stark. One person's words can alter the course of justice, inspire sympathy, or fuel suspicion. Memory can be both beacon and shadow, and when a child vanishes, as Madeleine did, the world must decide whether it is chasing evidence or chasing a story.